Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Michael Carducci, and I want to welcome you to the Denver Open Source Users Group. And today we are on a topic of value-driven development, but I am particularly excited because even though there are some folks, perhaps I'm not sure, joining us in this stream, if you are in the stream, say hello. I do see some folks in the stream. In fact, Scott, hello. Thank you for getting us the heads up on the no audio situation. Josh, always good to see you. And yes, where is a slate when you need one? But I am particularly excited because not only am I streaming today, which seems to be where I've been living this entire 18 months, going on 20 years, but we actually have a live studio audience. Woo! I cannot tell you how exciting this really is. But let's go ahead and dive into the content. And let's see if I can get all of my bits and pieces. As Dan did indicate, we are flying by the seat of our pants. But this is a talk that is very near and dear to my heart. In fact, for the folks who are tuning in, if you had your heart set on the resource-oriented microservices talk, I just want you to know that I did as well, and it just wasn't quite to the standard that I wanted it to be. So we're going to try to slot that in, maybe next month. It sounds like there's an open slot, but we'll find out. Today we're talking a little more philosophical, a little more entertaining, and maybe a little more practical and widely applicable. Because the reality is, there's a lot of deep technical topics that I'd like to talk about. There are a lot of things that I'm really excited about, things that I'm passionate about. But when I reflect back, especially where I am today in my career as a software architect, this might be the single most important skill that I've learned in my career. Because as we prepare to go into this field, you know, we get all of the answers in the training and the books that we read in our education, but what I find is maybe we have all the answers, but they never give us the question. So to kind of kick this off, this idea, this topic, this talk has been brewing for many, many years, and sitting on panels at conferences all over the world, giving talks, talking with attendees, talking with other speakers, other veteran software developers, software architects, something that I realized there are just certain truths that transcend everything else that we're doing, the fads that come and go, the buzzwords that come and go. And there are certain things that are just universally hard. One of the things that's universally hard, other than, of course, the two hard problems of naming things and cache invalidation and off by one errors, is decision making. You know, especially in my job now as an architect, people always ask me, they say, so should we do this or should we do that? Should we zig or should we zag? And of course the answer is always, it depends. What does it depend on? It really depends on the value that we are creating in what we do. And value makes the tech decision making easy. So how do we get to value? We have 10 what I would call truths or golden truths or rules. These aren't capital T truths. These are ideas. These are it just sounds better in the title. But we've got 10 of those, and we're going to be going through those over the next 90 minutes or probably less, because they're probably going to kick us out of here at some point, I assume. Is that right? All right. Well, at some point, I'm going to stop talking. At some point, folks are going to leave. Folks are going to log off. And hopefully all of this happens at the same time. So, starting from the beginning, golden truth number one. If you want to create value, if you want to be more valuable as a software engineer, one of the most important things that we can do is start with why. And Start With Why, of course, was a book written by Simon Sinek, and you know, it's largely focused on leadership, but I think there's some overlap in a lot of these ideas. You know, he starts with this, the golden circle. And on the surface of the golden circle, we have the what. Just beneath the surface, we have the how, and at the heart, at the center, at the core, we have the why. Now, normally when we approach software development, we're given the what. The POs or the business or the customer or whoever says what they want, and then we get together and figure out how we're going to do it, and then we ship it. And very rarely do we ever get all the way down to the core, all the way down to the heart, all the way down to the why. But the reality is, without the why, we can't consistently create deep value. To quote Tudor Girba, a very fascinating individual doing some really cool work on the future of software engineering, I highly encourage you to check this individual out. The value that we create isn't technical. Now, obviously, this is a counterintuitive thing because we are technologists. We peddle in technology. That is our stock in trade. So this is such a counterintuitive idea for so many reasons. For example, what dictates our value at hiring time? Well, at the core, it's usually our skill set multiplied by some integer number of years of experience, which is ultimately meaningless. And then they always ask us questions during the interview process, and rarely good ones. Have you ever been asked a question like this in an interview? I have only ever had to answer this question in an interview. I have never once sat down and written a quick sort, not even in school. But it's one of these things that we come up with. And this right here is a microcosm for what I'm talking about, this problem that is endemic in our industry. And I'm gonna get to that, but in my opinion, this question is almost but not quite entirely useless. It tells us so little about us, and I say that it's endemic because the reason we get asked questions like this now is because companies like Google and Amazon ask these questions, and well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And in fact, I've been asked that question exactly twice in my career. The first time I was a young green developer, I was fresh-faced and enthusiastic, and I came in to the interview, and they said, "Before we start, we have just a quick coding challenge for you." He hands me a whiteboard marker, and that was written on the board, and then he walked away for 15 minutes. And unfortunately, this was long enough ago that LTE wasn't a thing. 3G wasn't a thing. Edge wasn't a thing. GPRS was kind of a thing, but I didn't have it. I had no way to cheat on this one, and I realized that I hadn't done any kind of sorting algorithm since school, and I couldn't even remember which one a quicksort was. In my panic, I recalled a set of videos that we watched one day in one of my IT classes. They were Eastern European traditional folk dancers. I don't know if y'all have seen this or not, but yes, okay, we got some folks in the studio audience nodding. They are dressed in traditional folk outfits. They are wearing numbers, and they dance this hybrid fusion of their traditional folk dance to traditional folk music, and they're doing a dance interpretation of a sorting algorithm. So they would, come forward, and two of them would come forward, they would bow, and they would dance around each other and split. They'd do a bubble sort or whatever. And so I was, in my panic, I was racking my brain trying to figure out what is it that, which one is. I just picked one, and I guessed. And I wrote down some code on the whiteboard. The interviewer came back in, took one look at the whiteboard, looked at me and says, "Well, I think we've got all we need. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." And I'm thinking, wait, what? And I'm just like standing there, dumbstruck. And he just looks at me and repeats himself. "I think we have everything we need. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." He goes to shake my hand. And I had to ask, I said, "Okay, obviously I bombed. Tell me what I did so I don't bomb next time." And the guy looks at me and says, "Well, two things. First of all, that's a heap sort." I mean, I guessed wrong. I rolled the dice. Sometimes you roll that magic number, and sometimes you 7 out. And he says, "Second, it won't compile." I'm like, of course it won't compile. It's a whiteboard. But I was so devastated by that experience, I almost quit for good. I'm going back to TGI Fridays where they appreciate me. Enough with this IT stuff. But fortunately, I found a better gig, and things worked out. The second time that I got asked this question was many years later, and I was a little older, a little wiser, and a hell of a lot more cynical. And so I walked in that interview room, and the guy says, well, before we start, we got a quick coding challenge for you. And he's got the same thing on the whiteboard. They read the same Google blog post, and off we go. And he says, so I like to give candidates some privacy to do this. And it's never fun writing code on a whiteboard with an interviewer breathing down your neck. I'm like, how considerate of you. And he says, how much time do you think you need? And I said, oh, not much time at all. He's like, what, come back in 5, 10? I'm like, you don't even have to leave. And he says, okay. If you insist, I'll stick around. And I grab that whiteboard marker, I walk right up to the whiteboard, and I write arrays.sort. And you could tell his brain just like skipped like a needle on a record. And he was just stuck. He's like, you can't do that. I'm like, are you sure? Because I think I just did. He says, no, you can't do that. I'm like, well, it works. He says, well, I mean, technically, in whatever language we were in, he says, arrays.sort is a heap sort. I'm like, every time. Arrays.qsort. There you go. Test pass. And he says, no, I need you to do it. I said, why? And he looked at me, he says, well, I want to make sure that you're qualified for this job. I said, for this job? Maintaining an internal MVC CRUD web app. That's your metric for am I qualified to work on your cruddy, unintended, web app. And he said, yeah. And I said, then this is how I'm going to solve that problem. And we start arguing. And it starts escalating in a really uncomfortable way. Like our volume is notching up, and his volume is notching up, and it's just, and finally he's like, no, you need to answer the question. If you want to work here, da, da, da. And I said, well, it's an unfair question. He says, why is it an unfair question? You see, I realized what was really going on. A little light bulb went off in my head. And I realized this interview wasn't about me. It was about the interview. It wasn't what I knew, it was what they knew. And making sure that I knew that they knew this much, I know this much, and as long as we have this understanding, we're going to get along great. And so I said, it's an unfair question. He says, why is it an unfair question? I said, nobody could write a quicksort on a whiteboard off the top of their head. Zing. And he just looked at me and says, I could. Okay. Really? No, you probably just looked it up right before the interview. You like looked up the Wikipedia or whatever. And he's like, no, I could do it. I'm like, really? Would you show me? And he took the whiteboard, the marker, and did it. Wrote it out. And then we moved on to the next question. And by the way, every question was even dumber than that one. We were getting well into academia. To the extent that one of the questions, I kid you not, what are the 7 layers of the OSI model in order? Like, dude, I don't know. Like, to this day, I tell this story and I feel like I should really know. Like, I should just go look it up, but I don't care. That's how little I care about it. And it's like I had to learn this in school because we had a test on it, but, you know, it was an open book test. You know why? Because it wasn't that important. But, you know, he's asked me the stuff, and every time he asked me a question, I just came back and I'm like, well, nobody knows that off the top of their head. I do. And then he starts explaining all of the nuances of and the history of the Liskov substitution principle. I knew that one. I knew SOLID. I know what SOLID stands for. But you know, we're going through all this stuff, and I was in the interview for 3 hours. And pretty much I didn't know the answer to a single question. But once I figured out that this was really about ego and not about me, I breezed through this interview. I was barely a block down the street before the interviewer, the recruiter called me, and he says, hey, Mike, I just got the feedback from the client. Yeah. Home run. He says you knocked it out of the park. They want to set up round 2. And I said, haha, Paul, you got to do better than this. I'm a pass. But we see this all over the place for all kinds of misguided reasons, and I say that the question is almost but not quite entirely useless. Because we're starting with the how instead of the why. Well, I got to interview somebody. I mean, if you're anything like me, the first time you interviewed somebody, they're like, it's just you get somebody drops a resume on your desk, you get an invite in your calendar. And it's the first time ever I got to interview somebody. And I'm like, they're like, we want you to interview this candidate tomorrow. I'm like, okay. Well, I better Google interview questions. And then I'd find like 100 C# interview questions, and I'd start at 50. Because if the candidate's anything like me, they would have memorized the first 25 at least. So I want to switch it up a little bit. And we go and do this. We start with the questions instead of starting with what we want to learn. And I say it's a microcosm because we do the same thing when we're writing software. We start with the what before we think about the why. We start with the how before we think about the why. And it leads us in problematic directions from time to time. I'm inspired by a wise man, a great thinker, Michael Jackson. Not that one, the other one. Michael Jackson, professor at Carnegie Mellon, wrote a book called Problem Frames. And he had a similar observation that software engineers in general, we tend to spend our time in the solution space. Right? That's the interesting space. That's where all the cool tools are, all the cool toys are, and it's like where we're comfortable. Oh, we got a problem, I'm going to solve it this way. And so that leads to solution space thinking. And ultimately, that's where you're given a problem. We come back with, well, this is what I know how to do, so therefore that's how I'm going to solve the problem. And often, just the way we're taught, I mean, think about this. We're taught in terms of patterns and solutions. And then we go out in the real world, we don't deal with solutions, we deal with problems. But rather than developing and honing the skills to take and understand and tackle a problem and figure out the right solution, we tend to go about this the other way around. And so Michael Jackson came up with the concept of problem frames. So problem frames ultimately describe a recognizable class of problems. So think of like design patterns, but problem patterns, essentially. And you've got some language and some tools to tease those out of requirements. And when you have a recognized class of problems with a known solution, that's a problem frame. Well, we tend to do this the other way around. We tend to start with, well, this is my favorite language, my favorite framework, my favorite whatever. This is what I'm most comfortable doing. And sometimes we build the wrong thing or we find dead ends late in development. So I tell this whole long-winded story about the interviewer because I feel like this is a microcosm. This is the embodiment of this endemic backwards thinking that we're running into. And as software engineers, it's incumbent upon us to approach these problems from the right direction. And I love this quote that is supposedly attributed to Albert Einstein, although, I mean, I found it on the internet, so who knows? It's for all I know, Taylor Swift said it. But it goes something like this. If I had an hour to solve a problem, and in some versions, my life depends on it, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and only 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So what do we really want to learn from a candidate? I want to know how you're going to solve real-world business problems on a day-to-day basis. The first thing, anybody that I've hired, I don't tend to make them code on a whiteboard because we don't code on whiteboards. We have laptops, we have IDEs, we have access to Google and Stack Overflow. So I give them a real, well-scoped business domain problem and say, go solve it. Use whatever tools you want, use whatever frameworks you want, use whatever resources you want. And I remember the first time I proposed this to folks on my team, they were freaking out. They're like, well, what if they just go on Stack Overflow and copy and paste everything? Like, what if then? I'm not one to cast the first stone here because fully half of my browser history is Stack Overflow, and I am the 1% of greater than 20,000 rep Stack Overflow people who copy code at least 50% of the time that I'm hitting the website. And so I'm not going to, not only that, we're going to talk about the solution. I bring in the candidate, and I'm like, so tell me why you solved the problem this way. And if all they can come up with is because John Skeet said that's the best way to do it. I mean, objectively, that's not a bad answer, right? If John Skeet says it, it becomes canon. And I never realized how obscure of a reference that is. Of my live studio audience, how many people actually know who John Skeet is? You chuckled. Okay. All right, 50%. For those who don't, John Skeet is the most prolific contributor to Stack Overflow. Answers several hundred questions a day. Has out of the millions of users on Stack Overflow, it's like 20 million users. He's ranked number 1, and so he's a little bit of a iconoclast in Stack Overflow lore. And there are John Skeet jokes just like there are Chuck Norris jokes. You know, like John Skeet can divide by 0. John Skeet's compiler doesn't issue warnings; it apologizes. You know, John Skeet. I'm trying to remember some of these, like. His code doesn't have race conditions. The universe waits its turn. Things like that. So John Skeet is sort of a legend. In fact, funnily enough, John Skeet works for Google in England. At least last I checked. I don't know what he does these days. And his official job title at Google is of Stack Overflow fame. Not because his job is to answer questions. That's just what he does in his off time. But because in the company directory, it just shows up John Skeet of Stack Overflow fame. And that's the only reason his title is what it is. But I give people a well-scoped problem, and then we talk about it. And you know what I like to do these days? Give them the well-scoped problem, something that's going to take them 90 minutes, not a freaking week. Don't give people, like, actual project work. But my headphones are saying they need to be charged. So I'm just going to take them off. Don't give somebody something that's going to take a week to do, you know, like 90 minutes, the kind of commitment that you would need for a typical in-person interview. And so you got to think about this. You got to put some effort into these questions, but I don't want to hire the wrong people, and it's worth it for me to do this. And also, kind of once you do it once or twice, you can reuse those questions for a while, at least until they start showing up on Glassdoor. And but this is what I do, and lately I've been, we'll work on it. I'll give them the challenge, let them do what they're going to do, and then I'm going to pair with them. I want to see how we pair, how we work together, what their kind of coding style is, what their pairing style is, because this is something that I'm looking for, especially in my seniors, this ability to do this kind of thing. So, you know, and I like this quote from John Evans, wrote an article 6 or 7 years ago now called "Why the New Guy Can't Code." Aside from the unfortunate pronoun choice, or maybe it is just the guys, I don't know. But he says this, he says, I can guarantee you without fear of contradiction that no programmer will ever have to write a binary search after they are hired. It's like choosing a contractor because they know how to forge and cast steel using coal, iron, an oven, and a bellows when all they really need to know is A, the address of the nearest Home Depot, and B, what to do with the steel once they buy it. And Josh is in the comments here. This is why I lost it. I started cracking up. He says, can I use Copilot for interviews now? That's a great, I want to try that. I don't know if the microphone's picking it up, Josh, but they are chuckling at your line. I don't know. Is it Python only? I don't know. We got a lag on the stream, so we'll find out in about 10 seconds. But things to think about. What is your value proposition? Like, I don't hate the whiteboard. I want to be clear. I don't hate the whiteboard. I think it has a place. But it has a place if you are being thoughtful and deliberate, and there's a reason for it. There's a why for it. And so for me, so I think that's a terrible question in most cases. Unless of course you're hiring for developers to build libraries for other developers in the 1980s. Like if that's what you're doing, then yeah, we have a real need for that. Otherwise, JVM's got us, .NET got us, right? All these languages and frameworks, we kind of have this basic stuff. So for me, my value proposition is to create valuable functionality and, ironically, not code. And to kind of summarize this is code, this is value. And it's counterintuitive, but I would rather hire somebody who would write the one-liner. The person who wrote that one-liner shipped on time. The person who wrote their own quicksort, right? They haven't even checked in yet. They haven't even committed yet because they're still in their ivory tower trying to find a closed form solution to the problem. You know, but the reality is code is only one tool that we have at our disposal to create value. And this is where things really start to open up, where we find some freedom, and it kind of changes the entire dynamic of what we think an effective software engineer is. Ted DeZuba, a controversial figure in the tech blogging world some 15 years ago, I think he disappeared, wrote an article called The Three Tools of the Software Engineer, and defined the three tools as follows: money, time, and code, in that order. And he says that money is by far the best tool, best way to solve a problem, because it saves time and actually helps you avoid writing code. You can usually use money to solve performance and scalability problems. Now, you can't throw money at every single problem, unfortunately. One, money can't solve every problem, and two, there's always a finite amount of money. Unless anybody here or anybody on the stream work for a company that has an infinite budget, sub-question, are you hiring contractors? One thing I've learned as a consultant, if you can't be part of the solution, there's a lot of money to be made being part of the problem. So money can't always solve the problems. The second tool we have is time. If money doesn't work, you can invest time to research existing pieces of functionality that will solve the problem. And there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, most of what we do, we're building novel implementations of solved problems. And in fact, we do that so often, when I'm doing something seemingly straightforward and it's unbelievably difficult, I usually take that as a smell that I'm doing it the dumbest way possible. And it's like my signal to myself to put the brakes on and talk to somebody who isn't like myopically focused on all of this stuff. Because there are so many hard problems that were hard a couple of years ago, and literally it's just, oh, we just dropped in this piece of software. I mean, I remember running a microservice-ish environment 15 years ago. We didn't have Kubernetes. We didn't have Docker. Like, we had to do a lot of this stuff the hard way. We invented a lot of code to kind of do this stuff, and now it's, I don't want to say it's trivial, because, like, I don't understand Kubernetes, but I can make it work. But the thing is, we can invest time, and there's always stuff out there. Number 3 is code. I always treat writing code these days as the last resort for solving a problem, because it's a versatile enough tool that you can make it solve any problem, but every line becomes a liability, right? We become responsible for its design, its future maintenance, its monitoring, its testing, its profiling. I only write code when I've proven categorically that money and third-party software don't work. Oh, we have an answer, by the way, from the chat. Copilot works for Java, C#, Python, JS, TypeScript, and is aware of your project coding style, too. I don't think that's a good thing. Josh, you've seen my coding style. That's not a good thing. But going back to this, the worst thing that you could do is try the code tool first without considering money or time. When the first thing we do is dive into code, usually we're dooming ourselves to design an unmaintainable system, or we'll reinvent existing tools poorly. I love the way Ken Cousin puts it. He says, every time I've sat down and tried to reinvent the wheel, I only ever succeeded in reinventing the flat tire. And to quote Ted DeZuba on this comment here, I caught up on the stream. Joshua just posted, God no, don't want the model to be trained on your code. That would be bad. That would be like crossing the stream is bad. Yeah, so Ted DeZuba said, where am I? Postgres has never woken me up in the middle of the night with a segmentation filter and null pointer exception, but databases I've written myself have. And so I think about it is functionality is an asset, but code is a liability. And we'll keep going. So, okay, we need to know why to create value. But the next thing that we need is the ability to recognize value. And this one is tricky, because what I value as a software engineer isn't always what my team of software engineers value. And what they value is rarely what the customer values, and what the customer values is rarely what the business values. We've got all these different people, all with subjective definitions of value. So how do we resolve this? One of the first things we have to do is have some understanding of each of these perspectives. And there's a simple test, right? If you're solving the problems of the business and the customer, you're creating value. It's as simple as that. Or maybe, right? Because how well do we understand the customer? Not very well, it turns out. I've given this talk some number of times over the years in different places, and I would, whenever I had a quorum in the room with me, no offense, but it's still a little thin. Baby steps back to the new normal. I would survey the room, and I would ask the question: how many folks, if you didn't work there, would you ever use the software that you wrote? And almost universally, the answer is no. Like, I worked for a company, we wrote e-discovery software. I worked there for 2 years before, and built half of the flagship product before I knew what e-discovery was. All I knew is you click this button and that thing's supposed to happen, and I can code that up to do it. And that's a challenge, because rarely do we understand the business domain. But like, again, as an architect or as a senior developer, as a team lead or anything, like, what drives a lot of these decisions is the business requirement. Like, I know that when I click the button, it's got to put the foo into the bar, but I need to have some understanding of the business domain. And rarely do I ever, but even when I've had the opportunity, it turned out harder than I thought. About 10 or so years ago, I started a company called Showbiz CRM. For those who don't know me, I am a software engineer turned professional magician, turned back to the day job, thanks COVID. And now I work in an office. I was in the office today. I've still got my badge on. And but like any software engineer, and presented with a problem, how do we solve it? We throw code at it. So I started running a small business as a professional entertainer, booking my own shows. And the first thing I realized is running the business is a pain. I'm going to write some software to make this a lot easier. Now, thinking about all these, understanding the business domain, I mean, I am the user. I am the customer. Nobody knows my business better than me. I got this. I'm also the developer, which means I've got some baggage and biases and things like that. I'm also the business owner. I would like this $95,000 experiment to maybe turn a little profit. That was 11 years ago, and I would sure like this $95,000 experiment. Not costing $95,000. But here we are. I went and tried this anyway, and I tried to do it all the right ways. I got Jira and the Agile plugin. I'm like, I'm on it. I started writing user stories as a busy professional entertainer. I want the ability to predefine a series of steps that I can trigger to run automatically so that I can set and forget common and tedious tasks that run on a schedule. And I built this. You know, they say that developers build the best user interfaces. They'd be right. That's a work of art. No notes. Actually, I have no idea what on earth that is doing. But whatever. As a developer, it worked, right? I could check off all the functional requirements. Check. My tests pass. But as a developer, it worked, at least on my machine, right? As a user, it worked for me, right? Because I wrote it. I know where the bodies are buried. I know if you click on that thing without filling in that box, it's going to blow up. So you just don't click on that thing, right? How hard is it? My users, apparently very hard. Because it didn't work so well for them. They just got confused, and as a business, it failed. Despite delivering all the functional requirements, it created very, very little value. But, and this is what I want you to remember, sure, Showbiz CRM failed. Sure, it's a footnote in history. But at least the architecture. Pre-Kubernetes. Pre-containers. I had this set up on VMs using the cloud vendor specific API that if 100,000 users. By the way, our daily active user average was 12, and 3 of them were me, my main user, my admin account, and my test account. But if my 12 daily active users spiked to 100,000 simultaneously, and they all simultaneously kicked off one of those automation sequences, those requests would get put into a dynamic queue. And there was a monitor on that queue that would see that we crossed some threshold, and it would start spinning up VMs. And it could process that entire queue of 100,000 requests in like 9 seconds, and then those would decommission. Now we can do that for free, but back in the day, that was hard. And I was proud of that. I had something that I could brag about. But it failed. So long, farewell, Showbiz CRM. I feel like I need to pour one out. But we want to get invited back, don't we? Never mind. The organizer, he's saying, he's like, don't pour beer on the carpet. So I tried again. As a busy professional entertainer who's not especially technically savvy, I want the ability to predefine a series of steps I can trigger run automatically so that I can set and forget common TT's tasks that run on a schedule. And I built this infinitely better. Actually, it was the exact same thing. But because I approached it from the perspective of the user, and I actually used user stories the way they're supposed to be used, telling the story from the user's perspective, I was able to deliver the exact same features with a very different value. But of course, I delivered this to them, and they looked at me blankly in the same way that a cow looks at an oncoming train, and they say, so this is cool, what do I do with it? I'm like, you just take your business process and you put it into the system. And they look at me even blanker, and they say, business process? Yeah, your business process. Oh, you don't? Well, you know how sometimes you're on a project and you don't have a BA, so you're going to have to put the BA hat on and A your B? A your B? Plug it into C. And no. And then I'm like, okay, I don't have time for this right now. Let's talk later. And then 30 days later, I'd get that little email, that just little twist of the knife that says subscription billing agreement cancellation. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I call it self-founding a SaaS startup. As a busy professional entertainer who's not especially technically savvy and doesn't aspire to be a business analyst, I want the ability to predefine a series of steps that I can trigger run automatically so that I can set and forget common tedious tasks to run on a schedule. And I built this, a compose window with where's my laser? With a send later button. And they love it. Fewer features, the most value. It was only through understanding that the value and the priority changed. And it's nice. It's actually in people's hands. It's delivering value. And some of them are actually booking shows again because we're in this weird hybrid purgatory. It almost wasn't. I spent a lot of time at conferences and around luminaries and professional thinking persons. And I realized that I had my skill set, right? But like what I was doing wasn't cool. Like I used to be with it, and then they changed what it was, and now what I'm with isn't it. And what it is weird and scary to me. It'll happen to you. But yes, I'm glad I'm not so old that reference, or we're the same old, I don't know. But thank you for chuckling. And honestly, it's amazing telling a joke on a talk to the webcam and seeing somebody in the room laughing that isn't my wife with the pity laughs, because like she doesn't, my jokes are really even worse to her, but she knows that I'm like trying, because I'll tell the punchline like this, and she knows like I'm waiting for something. Oh. But it almost wasn't, because I realized I wanted to write something that I could show off, and I decided that I needed to use some kind of like hipster JavaScript framework that nobody had heard of yet. And in fact, the framework that I started with was so hipster, you probably still haven't heard of it. This was 6 years ago. And in fact, it was amazing. Like the level of genius necessary to take UI ideas that have worked flawlessly for 20 plus years and just break them, like the back button. Yeah, that was like a known issue in this particular frame where you hit back and it like your app loses state and everything. You go back to Google, and and the official guidance in the docs was tell your users not to use the back button, code one into your UI. And I'm like, yeah, that'll work. Just deprogramming 20 years of muscle memory, no problem. And in fact, that shows a tremendous lack of empathy for people. Like, it's not that easy. So actually, this brings us to golden truth number 3. By the way, we get faster. That's the only downside of, I don't mean to call you out, but the only downside of doing live presentations again is I can see when people are yawning. It's been a long day. We're coming off a 3-day weekend. Seriously, we're good. But at least when I'm streaming, I don't have to see that it's on in the background and they're actually playing Minecraft. I'm talking to you, Josh. But this is another one. The ability to empathize with other perspectives, right? I always describe empathy as distinct from sympathy, right? Sympathy is like, oh man, that sounds awful. Empathy is like feeling with. It's like, I feel you. I've been there. I know. I grok this. Because this is one of the things that we do have to develop this skill to be effective software engineers. Because without empathy, we truly can't gauge value consistently and accurately. And even if we can, value can and will change over time. But we've got to be able to put ourselves in the customer's shoes. And often we get into these conflicts where I want this and they want that and everybody wants whatever else. So, and I still to this day I find myself over-engineering things. And I get hung up on certain ideas and I'm like, yeah, we got to do this thing this certain way. And, one time I was building something and I wanted to push messages to the client rather than poll for updates. And I was building all of this infrastructure. I had like 3 new servers or VMs, or it was back in the day, because I needed redundancy in all of this. And I had a whole lot of code and like figuring out how to push things to the browser and do AJAX long polling and all of this. And I got asked a very important question. One of my peers who saw just how obsessed I had gotten over this, he says, bro, that was he was the original programmer. Hey, bro, does the user care? And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, well, okay, if you're pushing or polling, do they care? Is like how is it going to make their life better if you push this out? I'm like, well, they're going to get the update faster. He says, define faster. I said, well, we poll every minute. He says, yeah. And I said, so in theory, they might wait up to a minute to get that update. So that's a minute where they're waiting. He says, okay, what is the mean time to complete this process? I said, mean? I don't know. He said, well, let's find out. We have logs. Do a query. Average, start time, end time, sum, right? Let's aggregate this. Got the average, 22 and a half hours. He says, so do you think 22 hours and 30 minutes is much different to 22 hours and 31 minutes? He says, no. He says, let's be honest. The user's not going to care. You're spending all this development time and all these server resources to give them a real-time update on something they're not even looking at. They've gone home for the day. It's Miller time wherever they are, and that really shaped a lot of my reaction because the customer, right? The customer rules. The customer is king. The customer is whatever. This is what I've forgotten for half of my career as a software engineer. We write software for people, and I get so hung up on metrics and style. And Josh is like shaking his. Yeah, Josh. I knew it. Josh was playing Minecraft. I don't know if either that or he's playing along. In which case, but this is the thing. Like, we're building stuff for people, and we forget that we're writing software for people. And it doesn't matter. We have a customer. It doesn't matter if we're writing a back-end API. Like, I try to get my dev teams to treat the other dev teams as their customers, because they're the ones consuming your services. And think of them as your customer. We're writing software to serve these people. It's like, oh, no, it's computer to computer. No, people are part of this process. So it doesn't matter if we're building a back-end API or an app on a phone or anything in between. what we code should make somebody's life better in some measurable way. That's why we're getting paid. That's why people are paying for whatever it is that we're building. And so this is where it gets a little dicey, because our value as engineers is a function of our technical skills only because we use technology to solve the problem. So the solution to the problem might be technical, but the value is not. And great programmers will consistently bring value to the team and to the organization. And in 21 years now, as a coder, as a peer, as a leader, an executive, a business owner, as an architect, whatever, like, this is one of those truths that greatness is not something that can be found inward. It's something that can be found, that can only be found outward. The value that you create, not the things that you can show off. I have another entire talk on all the stupid things I've done in my career trying to be great, only to find out that I'll never be great, but I can be better. And I think I did this a year or so ago. Back, I think I did a double feature: Art of the Impossible and Ego-Driven Development. Anyway, it's out on YouTube somewhere, folks, if you want to watch it. But I can't endorse it. Modesty forbids me. So, great value. We want to make the most valuable thing. But this is where it kind of gets dicey, right? Compromise is inevitable, right? We've got to find that balance, because we want to create something that's perfect, that delivers all the value, that makes the customer's life infinitely better. But we also have to ship it. And we have to ship a version 1 before we can get to a version 2. And that's heartbreaking sometimes, because we want to be here and we're down here. And compromise is inevitable everywhere in the project. In fact, I imagine everybody in this room and all 7 of you on the stream, hi, 2 new people. You're late. My fault. We changed the stream the last minute. I would imagine all of the folks, virtually or in... Oh, 2 people just logged off. That's funny. Okay. Back to 5. I'll be all right. Anyway, everybody who's watching this now or in the future, at some point, we've probably drawn some variation of this on a whiteboard. And we say to the boss, the product owner, the business, the scrum master, whoever, pick any 2. And then we grin like we said something clever. And I don't know why we... Yes, Scott says don't scare them away. I don't know why we do this, because like there's a choice. They always pick the same 2, and we're like, okay, so we're in agreement then. No, not even close. It's a trap. Quality is implied. Yeah, we need all the features by the deadline, and if it doesn't work, it's not because we deprioritize quality, it's because you're a bad developer. Now, do not leave your desk until all those tickets are closed. Oh, is that all I have to do? Select all, mass update, close. Miller time. But not quite that easy. But this is one of those things. We do have to make those compromises. And we have to have those conversations, but maybe not when we typically have them, when the project is already late. As an engineer, I always want to make everything perfect. It rarely works out that way, only sometimes. But the reality is, engineering is not about perfect solutions. It's about doing the best under the constraints that you're given. So if our golden truth number, where were we? I've lost count. 5, I think, is compromise is inevitable. Then number 6, of course, is that we need to make the right compromise. And it comes back to this simple idea, this customer-centric approach. When compromising, does the user care? I note, by the way, that all my slides say user, and I keep saying customer, and I sometimes slip back. It's a habit I'm trying to break. It turns out there's only 2 industries in the world that refer to their customers as users, and we're the other one. So I'm trying to break that habit. But this is where this all starts building up. Because start with why. What is the value we're creating for the customer? Recognize the value from their perspective. Actually be able to look at it, walk in their shoes. With empathy and so on. this gets us here because what are we really building? What are the priorities? We have to be objective because I want to work with the coolest technologies and tools all the time. But sometimes the right solution is just like 2 lines of JavaScript, not 2 million lines of React. And I think that's actually how many lines you get by default with a create React app. I could be wrong, but I got Josh on the stream, and he knows more about this than anybody else I know, so we'll find out. And he may just go and do a line count. So we have to be objective. Sometimes just the little solutions are right. Not everything has to be an SPA. Not everything has to be microservices. Sometimes simplicity is the key and actually going to deliver more value than something we can show off. But compromise is inevitable. Doesn't mean we have to compromise on everything. Sometimes we have to push back on the wrong compromise. Because a lot of the compromise conversations are like the business coming to us, like, well, we just need to ship it. I don't care if it's perfect. And then, of course, they yell at you when it's not perfect. Like, you didn't see this bug? I mean, I saw it. You said ship it. But anyway, we have to push back on the wrong compromise. And sometimes it's them who needs to compromise. And, I talk about the trade-off triangle like it's anything useful. I find a more useful technique is at the beginning of a project to sit down and create what's called an agile inception deck. This was an exercise created by John Rasmussen, the author of a book called The Agile Samurai, which, despite being published over a decade ago, and Agile has the hype cycle of Agile's come and gone, and now my day job we use something called SAFe, which just makes me depressed. There's still a lot of gold in that book, and it's worth reading. It's also a light read. But I like this part of creating the Agile Inception. You get everybody together and you agree on the priority. And this is the thing, this is where the business really struggles because they don't understand typically priority. I remember I was on a project, a very late project. It was one of those death mark projects. We've all been there. And, I think it was 18 months behind schedule. And, I'd only been working on the team for a year, so not my fault. They added me to the team. That was on them. They made it later by hiring me. My boss never did read the Mythical Man Month, by the way, even though I bought him 2 more copies so we can get through it in parallel. It didn't work. And wow, that joke doesn't even work live. Now I can't lean on no audience when my jokes fall flat. It's not because there's nobody here to laugh. It's just not funny. But, he calls us into the office to yell at us. And he calls, Josh. He calls into the office to yell at, calls us into his office to yell at us. We all march in, sit down, and yells for like 45 minutes. Actually, the only time I've ever seen somebody yell so much and so violently that they literally started foaming at the mouth. Like just the airflow and the everything just like frothed his saliva up like a meringue. And it was kind of like a, thanks Scott, kind of like you kind of spray out like if you've ever been in the ocean with a little foam and it hits the rocks. It was like that. It was mesmerizing. I didn't listen to a word he said. I was mesmerized by the foam and the spray and everything. And pre-COVID, I'd be horrified now. So I don't know what he's saying, but then he says something. I catch like not the words, but the sound, a little up intonation, like. Brr, brr, brr. And then I look up. He's looking at me. I'm like, that was a question. Fortunately, I am well practiced at answering questions that I wasn't listening to. And the secret is you got to come back with something like general and non-committal. You're like. You start throwing out platitudes. Well, we could talk until we're blue at the face, but at the end of the day, and then you just say something that they can't disagree with. At the end of the day, we've got to ship. Yeah. And so I realize kind of where we're going. It's easier to do this now, by the way, with Zoom and Teams and everybody like, oh, sorry, you cut out there for a second. Could you repeat that? My connection must be bad. You can't do that in real life. And he says, he's like, well, where do you want to go from here? I'm like, so I grab a marker, I go over to the whiteboard, and I start writing stuff down. And I said, I write down all the outstanding stories. And I said, what on that list is top priority? He looked at the list, he looked at me and says, well, they're all top priority. Every single item on that list is top priority. Okay. So I turned to my team and I said, good news. We can work on whatever we want because everything over there is low priority. Once he'd calmed down again, I explained politely that, sir, priority is a relative ranking of importance. The priority of one item is relative to the priority of its neighboring items. If they are all high priority, ipso facto, they are all low priority. I'm sorry if that sounds patronizing. That's talking down to something. I didn't say that. I wanted to. I was like this close, but I didn't want to find another job that year. That'd be 3, and just it's a lot of effort, man. Got to get my benefits changed. Got to find a new doctor. You know how it is. So I explained, and I said, look, okay, imagine this. Yeah, you go antiquing. I didn't even know antique could be a verb until I met this man. But sure enough, you go antiquing. He says, yes. I said, you buy a lamp, one of these oil lamps, these old antique bronze oil lamps. You're cleaning it up, and a genie pops out. Genie says, you get one wish. What do you wish for? And he says, 25 wishes. I said, spoken like a true project manager. You get one. And that was your only warning. Don't make the genie mad. And he thinks about it for like a solid 5 minutes. And then he gives me his one wish. I write a little 1 next to it. And I said, hey, guess what? It's your lucky day. Genie says you get 2 wishes. He says, I understand. I said, you didn't 5 minutes ago. And we do this. And we actually prioritize this stuff. And this is what people need to understand. This is why I like this exercise so much, because there's only one rule. No 2 sliders can occupy the same space. And they really have to think about this stuff. And in fact, it's a whole lot easier to have these conversations at the beginning of the project rather than the end of the project. Like when you're late and you're like, okay, cool, what can we cut? That's not a business discussion about priorities. It's the devs weaseling out of their commitment. And instead we say, look, we're going to go on this eyes open, fully realizing that I need to not look at the chat. Josh says for the React, he says, too many to count. But the first question I'd be asking you, why are you using React? Because I hate myself, Josh. Yeah, because I wanted uncountable number of lines of code. It may be. This is, but I totally lost my train of thought. Yeah, we got to have these conversations. So if you have them at the end of the project, it just feels like developers weaseling out of the project. But if we go in at the beginning, we say, look, things happen. My sincere hope is everything's going to go swimmingly, but if it doesn't, we're going to have to make some decisions. So what can give? Where do we have slack? Is it on the budget? Is it on the scope? Is it on the release date? Where's that slack? And it's so much easier to have those conversations up front. And the other one is you can only deliver on your commitments when the business delivers on theirs. I know we're almost at time, depending on what your definition of time is. We're almost to the end as well. So we're going to wrap up very rapidly, but I'm going to tell you one more story because I love this story. It actually warms my heart on depressing, isolated COVID days. The same boss, by the way, you could tell we had what some might refer to as a strained relationship. One of the reasons we were so late on this project is we kept inviting him to the sprint review, and we'd demo what we built, and he'd say, oh yeah, that wasn't what I wanted, go build it again. And we would, because we were suckers. And it was like demo-driven development. Build me something, no, that's not quite it. Build me something, no, that's not quite it. Build me something, I changed my mind. And finally I'm like, dude, you're going to have to articulate what you really want, because this is taking forever. We're never going to finish if this is how we're rolling. And I actually held his feet to the fire in a sprint planning meeting, and I said, all right, I'm going to need clear conditions of acceptance. Bullet point this. Everything you want. So at the end, we've got clear goalposts. We know where the finish line is. And we go on bullet point this. And then, of course, like clockwork, I could have bet my house on how this would turn out. We got to the sprint review. We demoed it. And he says, that's not what I wanted. You need to go build it again. That's not what I asked for. And I said, no, it's exactly what you asked for. And he actually does this. He knocks on the table. He's like, Mike, you need to work on your listening comprehension. I said, no, you need to work on your conditions of acceptance. See, all these bullet points are met, so I'm going to go ahead and drag this to the accepted column, and if you thought of something else you wanted, go ahead and put something in the backlog. I trust you remember your JIRA credentials. And this is the thing. You know, we can only deliver on our commitments when the business delivers on theirs. There's all this focus on, well, you know, we got to do this and we got to do that and we got to estimate right and so we're padding, of course. But we have a deal, and the deal is they're going to tell us unambiguously what they want. We're going to commit to deliver by a deadline, and they're going to commit to leave us alone until that deadline. It's a simple system. But one, we always had fires in the middle of the sprint. And two, we never got those requirements. Like, this is an untenable situation. So I made this big grand stand in the sprint review, and the next day we had our sprint planning meeting. And funnily enough, he didn't show up. So I rescheduled the meeting. And he didn't show up, and I rescheduled the meeting, and he didn't show up, and this went on for about a week and a half. Finally, one day he catches me in the hall. I have, actually coffee, not beer, that would probably get me fired. But he catches me in the call, and I got my cup of coffee. He's like, hey, Mike. Hey, boss. How's the sprint going? I said, we haven't started yet. We're still waiting for you. Current meeting's 1 o'clock today. You think you'll make this one, or should I just bump it to tomorrow? And he says, what? Can't start the sprint without the product owner. You'll be there, right? We get pulled into a little impromptu meeting right then and there. Words are exchanged. I'll spare you the details, but basically he says, what the hell have you been doing for the last 2 weeks? I said, I can't speak for the rest of the team, but I've been leaning on my shovel. And he says, what? I said, unless you're going to tell me what to build, I'm not going to, I mean, if you want me to just build random stuff, I go back to the Oiler project. I got a bunch of cool things I want to work on. But if you want me to actually add business functionality, you got to tell us what it is and tell us, where the finish line is. And so we had another one of our heated discussions. Good news, bad news. Good news, he or his proxy was present at every single subsequent sprint planning meeting. Bad news, I got put on a performance improvement plan. Wasn't the first time, wouldn't be the last time. And you know what? I've been on several now that I think about it. I don't think I've ever been on a performance improvement plan that actually improved my performance. Oh, anybody else? Did it improve your performance? No. All right, we got to wrap this up. Let's bring it home. It is Shiner time. It is definitely Shiner time in Texas. And all right, we're still streaming. Great. And hopefully audio is still working. Yep. All right, we're rolling. So this is where I lose people. Embrace technical debt. Up until now, everybody's with me. They're like, yeah, whiteboard interviews are stupid. Yeah, stick it to your product owner. Yeah, wait, what? And I'm watching the stream. I'm waiting to see if more people log off. All right. See, now I need to wait for the lag to catch up. And now there's this awkward pause, and somebody's going to log, and I don't want, yes, stay, please stay. You'll hurt my feelings. But this is where I lose people, and this is the thing. Like, Technical debt is a concept we invented to explain to those individuals that we lovingly refer to as bean counters why cutting this particular corner is a bad idea. And it doesn't usually work. You know, we're like, hey, we could pay now or pay later. Always more expensive when you pay later. And they're like, yeah, that's cool, we'll pay later. And you're like, what? No, it's debt. Debt is bad. We don't want to be in debt. And then later we're like paying. It's like, well, we could pay interest or we could pay principal. And they're like, we're paying interest right now. And you're like, what? No, we need to pay the principal down. The reason I think this fails so often is it's too good of a metaphor, right? Because to the bean counters, debt is a useful financial instrument. It's a necessary financial instrument. They understand debt. They understand debt better than we do. And sometimes borrowing money is the right thing to do. And in fact, you know, for a while, years ago, I was an investor. I had shares in Apple. I sold them. I wish I hadn't, but you know, that's how life goes. And I used to get like the report, you know, and the balance sheet and all the stuff, and it's like a company like Apple with like $1 trillion in cash reserves or something, some ungodly number like that. How do they have debt on their balance sheet? They have literally like $20 billion in cash. Like a Walter White style storage unit, I'm sure. I have no idea. And yet they borrow money because that makes the best business sense in certain cases. And so it's not that all technical debt is good or bad, and we shouldn't embrace all of it, but we should realize that there's value in embracing strategic tech debt. You know, sometimes the most valuable thing that we can learn by delivering software is, are we even building the right thing in the first place? And if we invest all of this time gilding the lily to build the perfect MVC, and we find that's the entire wrong product, well, that's all wasted. And likewise, if we throw that MVC out there, we slapdash it together and throw it over the wall, and it's barely hanging together, but the customer's like, nope, that's not it at all. Well, that's all debt that gets written off. And so, like, value is subjective, and sometimes the highest value that we can deliver is not perfect code, but the answer to a simple question. That being said, golden truth number 9 is to avoid technical debt. I know these are seemingly contradictory positions, but in reality, Josh works in credit. He says, I know how debt works. True. We want to avoid technical debt. And these are seemingly contradictory, but the reality is we want to embrace strategic technical debt. You know, sometimes it makes sense to borrow money or borrow quality, but we don't want to do this unnecessarily, right? It does come back and haunt us. It does come back and bite us. So we want to be mindful of all this stuff. You know, I saw a great talk. Somebody gave a great talk, an entire 90-minute talk on tech debt. And it was actually beautiful. And I said to myself, I should bookmark this. And then my ADD brain said, bookmark, book. You should read that book. That book that's been sitting there haunting you. Have you read it yet? You're definitely going to need that soon. Speaking of books, you know, your friends are reading Infinite Jest. Maybe you should give that another attempt. What the heck's wrong with you? It's only 1,100 pages. And then I go on this whole spiral, and I don't know where I go next. David Foster Wallace, This Is Water, Fish, My Sister, Scuba Diving, right? It just gets crazy. And then I never bookmarked it. Long story. I don't know if I've mentioned this or not, but ADD is my super. But at the cost of I don't have the video. But I will find it someday, and I will tweet it. So follow me. Anyway, and this brings us to the end to maybe the single most important skill I've developed in my career, the ability to communicate in terms of business. That you know, when we talk to our boss, when we talk to our product owners, people like that, we tend to frame things in terms of how it'll benefit us. hey, it's probably time we get off job sick. Kind of sucks. None of the cool stuff that I want to work with supports it. And, it make my job so much easier if we could, like, use something from the last 5 years, maybe 8, 11. I mean, I'm not picky. And the problem is, like, the business doesn't care about making your life better. You go and be like, hey, this is going to make my job easier. They're like, well, suck it up, buttercup, because that's why we pay you the big bucks to do a difficult job. And it's just a wrong way to frame it. If we come in instead and we think in terms of business value and then we communicate in terms of business value, it's an entirely different conversation. Like going in and figuring out what the business value is for your boss. Like maybe it's speed. You could reframe this whole conversation. Just say, hey, so I got the new requirements for this PI. There's 2 different ways I could do it. I could do it the usual way. It'll take about 3 months, or we could do it this other way. It'll take. Obviously, which one we do, that's a business decision. That's up to you. And they'll just look at you like, 3 months versus 2 weeks. Why are we doing it the 3 months way? Let's do it the 2 weeks way. And you're like, I know, right? Okay, well, it's got to require a couple of things. And like, do it. Speed to market. Customers happy. Customer satisfaction. Ship it. Woo! And whatever other buzzwords they've picked up over the time. When we're not on camera, I'll tell you my buzzword story. But sorry, folks. But not for the screen. And maybe not for the user group. I don't know. We'll find out. I may never be invited back. But, the other one, like, imagine this. Imagine you're the business owner, and the devs come up, and they say, hey, I got an idea for you, okay? All right, here it is. We're going to take everything we have, right? All of our IP, basically the heart of our company. Okay? We're going to throw it away. Hang on, hear me out. We're going to throw it away, and we're going to build it from scratch. Okay? Now, if our estimates are correct, in 9 months, we're going to be at feature parity. In other words, from your perspective, we will be exactly where we are today, modulo 9 months of retail sales. How does that sound? And they're going to say that's the stupidest idea they've ever heard, because from a business standpoint, it's suicide. But think in terms of business value, communicate in terms of business value. And this is why I've always been a proponent of Agile, even though Agile's not cool anymore. Because somewhere little a Agile turned into big A Agile and safe and all these other insane things. But at the heart, right, fast feedback, value and understanding drive effort. Like that's the heart of little a Agile. And this is really what brings us all together with the why and empathy and fast feedback. And sometimes we just throw something out there and we learn. And then we evolve, we iterate. Which brings me here to the close to a quote from the legend that is Matt Stein. And, frameworks come and go, languages come and go. But if you're able to create business value, you will be in demand. Thank you, folks.